Yo, what's going on, family? My name is Matt Smith, aka MDS, the EQ coach, and welcome back to another episode of The Baggage Claim. This is the podcast where we unload all the things that we're carrying so that we can travel lighter through lives at our jobs, through lives at home, and our journey through faith. So pack your bags, grab your courage, let's rehuman together. So today, what's really funny is that I was going to talk about something completely different, and then we had some technical difficulties, and the entire video got deleted. And so we're going to talk about something completely different because I just feel like this is going to flow a little bit smoother. But first and foremost, thank you for all the support. Again, if you are coming back to watch another episode, that means that you've gotten some value from the things that I've shared up until now. And I couldn't be more grateful, y'all. Like, sincerely, honestly, I struggle with the idea of letting all these things go, right? These are things that I don't typically talk about in a public forum. And though I know there's tremendous value surrounding having these conversations, it's a little awkward. You know what I mean? Like, if you caught the last episode, I'm sure you can understand, like, that was an awkward moment. Not just the podcast itself, but the reception. There's this weird, interesting tension, right, between the reception of those who have received it and can relate with the stories, and a heartbreaking, weird catch 22 thing that's going on where I don't want them to necessarily relate, right? Like, I don't want anybody to have lived the experiences that I've lived or anything similar. And yet, I'm very, very grateful that it provides some space for catharsis and healing and all that. So I say it to say that it's not easy. And the first thing that I do when I sit down and record, I pray and I ask for a lot of stuff. You know what I mean? I express gratitude to God for being able to do this. And then I ask that I be completely removed from the equation, that it's not about seeing me, that it really isn't about what would be, I don't know, bolstering in terms of my identity or the platform, that it really wouldn't even be a thing about uh, making sure that it's most digestible to you as the audience. And that seems crazy and counterintuitive, right? Like, obviously, I want you guys to take some value and be engaged and enjoy the conversation. But at the end of the day, I know that I have the potential to get in the way of all that. I know that if I don't make the declaration out loud that I want this to be a thing that's not focused on people pleasing, I want this to be a thing where the last consideration I have is, what do I look like? Right. And really let the words move with power and create the ideal space for anyone who's out there searching for answers or for truth or just for a place to feel safe, that all that's provided in the time that I do this, right? And so, as a follower of Jesus, I believe in the triune God, right? God the Father, Jesus Christ the Son, and then the Holy Spirit, the companion. And so I ask the Holy Spirit, can you remove all the stuff that has nothing to do with what you're trying to do or what God is trying to do? And can you take the wheel, right? Um, and it's really interesting because that's not how I've always operated. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. I've been I have a huge ego. I have an enormous ego. And so I have to be aware of that. And I know that if I leave it up to me, I'll be sitting here adjusting my hat and wiping off my shoes. And you know what I mean? Like, I'll be correcting everything and overthinking things to a degree that's terribly unhealthy. But that creates a barrier, right? That makes it a thing where I'm not trying to connect, I'm trying to convince. And I don't repeat myself a lot because I don't feel like there's a need to convince anyone of anything anything that's going on with me, right? I'm kind of a straight shooter. I've gotten to a point where I absolutely say what I mean and mean what I say. I don't mince words, but there also is a great bit of consideration as to what is being received and how I can be most aware of getting down to my humanity and really searching to the deepest parts of my heart, pulling that out and revealing that so that someone believes that it's safe enough to do that. And even more ideally, that someone would believe that I'm an example that they would want to follow in that right. And I'd be the first to tell you that really it just is the answered prayer, the fulfillment of uh the supplication, right? The ask to let it not be about me. There's been a time in my life where I've said those kinds of words where I've, aw shucks and all of that, and have really just put on the performance of meekness. And I'm grateful that I've grown confident in who I am to the point where I don't have to fake anything. I don't feel the compulsion to fake anything. And I think these conversations have led to that, or have lent to that, right? I'm hoping that what most people get is that this is me authentically. Um it's funny, I was talking to a friend, um, and they were giving me their feedback on the last episode, and it was awesome. This is someone that I haven't known for a long time, but their feedback is incredibly valuable, and we're of like mind and have even studied a lot of the same things, the same thought pattern, and even share some of the same inspirations in terms of leaders that we know or figureheads that we know that we respect. And this person mentioned a moment in the last video where I talked about being canceled. And they were like, it's funny, you've completely switched up from the persona of the Zen centered, expert, subject matter expert. And, you kind of were a different person. And I was like, that's on purpose. I am a dynamic person. I am to this point as adjusted as I'm going to be with the amount of work that I've done and the amount of leaning on God that I do. Um, and yet I still have all the influences that have made me. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, I'm a kid from Rialto, California. You know what I'm saying? I was hood adjacent. I wasn't the knucklehead kid, but I ran around with a lot of knucklehead kids, right? Like they were saying cuz and I was saying cuz, you know what I'm saying? And it wasn't like I knew consciously that I was glorifying those things. Those were just the influences. And even now, right? Like I don't gangbang or anything like that. Far from it. And I just think that the more valuable thing is being able to see all of someone, you know? I think that's humility. And there's a lot of talk about what humble is and what humble isn't. And, I think a lot of people wouldn't even necessarily suggest that humility is always a good thing. Some people would say that pride or ego are required for certain moments and in certain scenarios and situations. And I don't know, I think courage is required in certain situations. I think thinking outside of yourself or even tapping into a very primal area in yourself, a very uh, you know, base area of yourself, that if you have full confidence in all of yourself, you're not afraid of showing. And I think for so long, especially in the community of faith, it's been a thing where you don't want to present your entire self, right? I kind of call it a performance based gospel. And the thought in the back of your head has more to do with how many things can I do to look the way that I think God wants me to look so that I could be accepted by his love, right? And nothing could be further from the truth in terms of what it takes for God to love you. As a matter of fact, it doesn't take anything for God to love you. God loves you right where you are. And I know a lot of people don't believe that. As a matter of fact, I know a lot of people would argue that that's not the case, right? They would ask questions like, why would a loving God allow for such catastrophe and calamity? And why do babies get murdered and things like that? And the honesty is, he loves you enough to allow you to make your own choices. He loves you enough to give you free will. That way, when you return back to him, you can understand the value of that love. You know what I'm saying? I think I think it's let's take the the example of someone who's in an abusive relationship, right? Which sorry if that's triggering, but we're kind of going to go there just for a second. So there's a thing called Stockholm syndrome, right? Where the person who's captive or held in that relationship start to question their own reality and then also start to have a certain type of affinity for the figure who's in control. And control isn't love, right? Anybody from the outside of that circle would be like, yo, he doesn't love you. She doesn't love you. She's taking advantage of you. He's taking advantage of you. He wants control. He doesn't want trust. He doesn't want mutual respect. He wants to groom you into what he thinks you should be. And he's going to use a forceful hand to do that, or she's going to use a manipulative hand to do that, right? She's going to break you down with words, and she'll either seduce you, or she'll shame you, or she'll try and frame you, and all those will be things that are damaging to your psyche, to the point where you don't know what's healthy. You don't even know what's true or honest. You just are so caught in the experience that, as my good friend Dr. Kimberly Weeks would say, you are caught in this addiction loop. You're being taught or fashioned to be dependent upon that dynamic. And that's such a terrible and toxic place to be. And we consider that God doesn't do that. He just allows for a broken people who made the decision to be apart from him and effectively just take the consequences and run with it. If you which I do, believe the story of Adam and Eve in the garden and all the rest of that. He allowed for free will. And that's the best kind of love. You know what I mean? If I got to keep you in a cage in order for you to in order for me to feel like we have a loving relationship, that's not what that is. That's my insecurity bleeding over into my behavioral patterns. And that's at the cost of you, your psyche, your perception of reality, and most importantly, at the cost of the truth. And so I believe that God is a loving God, and we understand the value of that because he doesn't make us love him. He doesn't even make us obey him. And yet, if we were to turn back to him from a place of desperation or whatever and say, God, where are you? I need you in this moment. And we were honest in our heart, he would meet us right there in that moment. And how do I know that? I've experienced that. Man, maybe just recently, for the first time, for the first actual time in my life, I've truly experienced that. I've truly come to understand what the love of a father that will not see you any other way other than as valuable and precious as he made you, as valuable and precious as that moment when you came out the womb. And even beforehand, when when my partner and I got pregnant, what was really funny is I had this intuition that we heard that we were gonna have twins, and that was wild, right? Like, we honestly, it was really exciting to hear that we were pregnant. It was not as exciting to hear that we were having two, right? Because you have all the thoughts in your head. Well, how am I going to make this happen? And oh my gosh, now that means I have to double up on everything. That, initially that means like two cribs and two bottles and two pacifiers and twice the diapers and twice the onesies and things like that. But then you start considering what that looks like down the line, and like, yo, that's two proms. That's two cars that you have to buy at the same time, right? If you got it like that. Or two kids doing two different types of activities. How do I have the capacity for that? Um but I always had this intuition that I was going to have a boy and a girl. As soon as we heard that we were going to have a twins, I was like, I think we're going to have one of each. And what was wild is that that happened. Um, and I started considering what the relationship with my son would look like in contrast with the relationship with my daughter. And I grew up in a household full of women, right? So I've never really questioned what it would take to relate to a female, you know? Um I just have more experience and more practice in that, I guess. Growing up, I had more female friends than I had male friends. Um, when I had true friends, right? Not just associations and things. But I think about what I had considered in terms of what my relationship would be with each one of them individually. And I had to also consider, what if I didn't like them? You know what I mean? Like, what if I created some monsters who were nothing like me, I couldn't relate to, and just went out and started wilding all the way out. And yet, when the twins were delivered, I had the privilege of catching them both. And I know that's a rare experience. I know not a lot of fathers get that privilege. And so I was crazy grateful for that. But we had a moment where um, my partner delivered my daughter first, and it took an hour and 20 minutes for my son to be delivered. And so you could only imagine, right? Like, I'm there, I'm holding my daughter, and I'm singing Louis Armstrong songs to her and stuff like that. Like, I'm doing everything I can to keep myself present and sane and not consider the possibility of, what if this boy, and what if their mother, whom I love dearly, what if they both die on this table? What if it's just me and my daughter for the rest of my life? For an hour and 20 minutes, right? While I'm there rocking her and I'm like, under a blanket of blue, right? Like, I'm just not I'm doing everything I can to not entertain all the dark thoughts. And there was a moment where I kind of looked down at that girl, and she was a little small, and of course eyes are closed and all the rest of that. And some peace fell over me. And I can't explain the peace. I can't explain why I believed that everything was going to be all right in that moment. Um, we had a whole team. We had a midwife, and we had the OB, the doctor who was going to deliver, and it was, we had our doula in there. You know what I mean? Like, I was like, we got it. We're solid. We got a squad, or at least that's what you think objectively, and then you get into the reality. It's like, oh, we're 30 minutes in and he's still not out. Oh my god, we're 50 minutes in and he's still not out. Right. Um, Long story short, everything went well. Obviously, I have both my kids now, but there was this moment where the peace came over me, and I uh I thought, well, if it's just us two, then that'll do. I'll be all right. I'll grieve for longer than I've probably ever grieved in my life. I will feel a particular way about how I showed up in the situation, and could I have been more prepared, and could I have offered more, and all the rest of that. Um but the second I got outside of myself, I found peace. The second that I just delved into the responsibility of loving something that had no capacity to understand what was going on, no say so in the way that anything was going, I found a peace. And it's interesting what happens when you get outside of your own self. And again, I believe you're only able to do that as you wrestle down the full reality of who you are. And so, in that moment, I had to consider that I was a crybaby, and I was scared, and I was, not as wise, or as composed as I'd like to think myself to be. I was I was a mess, and at the same time, I was a capable, loving father, and at the same time, I felt like a child, and at the same time, I was the most determined hero that can never be written in a comic book. Um, and all that is happening at once. And as I got grounded in knowing that all of those things were components of my humanity, I could get outside of myself, and I could be present for everyone else. And that was a really, really powerful moment. And then I thought and considered that's the way that God loves us. God understands us because he has all the same components that we do. We're made in his image and his likeness, right? So he's an emotional being, right? Like there's plenty described in the word that he experiences joy and, wrath and jealousy and all of those things. And even still, he doesn't use those things to keep us bound to him. He allows us to experience all of those things independently. And then as we recognize that that is his personality or his likeness in us, his spirit in us, as I believe, then we're drawn back to him. Uh, but I'm sure that God knows that he could make us do anything, right? And yet he doesn't. He could have let us run amok and could have been justified in being like, all right, this is how y'all act, and I don't want nothing to do with you ever again. But he stepped out, you know, stepped out of the space of heaven so that he could be brought as low as possible. Right. There's a lot of things that we talk about in the church, and especially when we consider like the birth of Christ, right? Like we're like, first off, the story is crazy. You know what I mean? Like the story is crazy, right? Immaculate conception, a virgin teenager. You know what I mean? All that is wild. It is not lost on me that like some people believe in aliens. I believe that God incepted a teenage girl, right? Um, but as I go through that and I think about God's essence being put into that woman, and then considering that that essence was going to become a baby, you know what I mean? Not a super being, not uh a full grown man, right? Like it was, he could have just, I don't know, he could have just came from the sky and like landed on the ground in that, like, that superhero pose where they got the fist down on the ground and the one knee's down on the ground or whatever, and then they look up, right? Like Iron Man does. Um, he could have did that. He didn't do that. He brought himself as low as possible so he could relate, right? He not only had to depend on his mother and nurse and, you know, throw up on himself and, you know, poop on himself and all of that. You know what I mean? He then also had to grow and learn language. He also had to be subordinate to other human beings, you know? He had to be disciplined. Shoot, he was born in a feeding trough. You know what I'm saying? That's what a manger is. It's the thing that you pour slop in so that goats and pigs can eat and all the rest of that. He was born in that, or was laid in that after he was born. And like that's not a glorious story at all. You know what I mean? That's like that's the worst way to come into the earth. Or at least I'll say the most humble way to come into the earth. And so it's not as though God wasn't aware at any point in time of who he was and what he was capable of. The decision to reduce that down to even below what an adult human being was capable of is the greatest display of humility that I think I could ever conceive, right? And so taking it back to my experience of of love and grace for the first time, I spent a whole lot of my life pretending and performing and putting on a mask and not being as authentic as I am now, not being as courageous as I am now. As a matter of fact, being pretty much a coward, you know. And I had legitimate reason to be afraid, or at least I believed I did. You know, I dealt with I kind of relate this experience to that of an orphan. You know what I mean? An orphan feels abandoned. An orphan feels like there's not enough resource around based on what they see in their environment, right? An orphan feels like they're not responsible for all of the things that they see. And for the most part they're not, you know. It's a tough thing to be um effectively given up, you know, and left in a space where those that were supposed to care for you by the way that it's designed, those that you were supposed to be around for your entire life, um, haven't been there, you know? And I think we can all relate to that to some degree. All of us have some orphan tendencies. All of us have to trade in the heart of the orphan for the heart of uh, one that belongs, right? Heart of one that's grafted into the inheritance, one that's part of the family, and that's not an easy transition. I know that for myself, having that orphaned heart has created things like envy and competition and scarcity mindset and blame and irresponsibility and anger and resentment and pride, you know? But it wasn't until I got to a point where I could recognize again that all of those things were just natural parts of me and accept that for what it was and not make that the reason that anything happened, or that anything is going to happen moving forward, but let it be a portion that I could accept and fully love, that I felt God's love come in. Now that didn't come without struggle. I had to be beaten down into that place, right? Like, it's a funny thing about humility. Um, in First Peter chapter 5, uh, it says, "Humble yourself, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time." Right? There's no in between space as far as that's concerned. You're either humble or you're exalted, right? Even in your own mind, you're either down low or you're up high, and you can't just kind of be egotistical. You know what I mean? You can't just kind of be humble, right? There's no gradient for that. You either, it's very, it's very black and white as far as I'm concerned. Um, if you have any other arguments, I would love to hear them. However, I just believe that's kind of what it is, right? You're either humble or you're proud. Um, and if we're all being honest, there's probably a greater degree of pride that we have than humility, right? Humility is a challenge. Humility is something that has to be developed. Pride is pretty natural. You know what I mean? Um, and the funny thing about it is whether you think you're great or whether you think you're not, you're still thinking of self. Pride is insidious, man. You know? Uh, but me myself, I had to be beaten down, and I had to be beaten down over and over and over again. I had to be beaten down to the point where I had to question things. You know, I had to grow up in poverty. I had to um, have the experience of rejection over and over again. I had to deal with um, those who were in my authority and were there to protect me and there to love me, not necessarily being there all the time or even being there in the times where I really truly needed them. And what that bred in me was the pride to hide, um, and to be so proud that I wouldn't let anybody in, you know. But when you get exhausted, some of us, if we're too tired or we're too hungry or whatever, uh, we get a full understanding of like the very wide spectrum of our humanity and our personalities, right? I used to be the cat who, if I was tired, like really tired, like really really tired, I would cry. You know what I'm saying? Like it would just get to be too much for me, and then just like the tears would pour out, you know. And that's evidence of a person who's pretty emotionally repressed. um but I would cry, And that's how my mother always knew. It was like, oh, Matt's tired. You know what I mean? He's crying, you know, um, because he doesn't cry for anything else other than that. Um, but I've had enough experiences that have brought me to that place of tears and frustration and rage, you know? And it wasn't till I fully submitted that, until I was fully honest with God. You know what I mean? I'm in some of the most challenging times of my life, you know, and I'm furious with God and I'm letting him know. It wasn't until that point that I felt loved and accepted, because moments after that, something would come along to relieve whatever tension I was holding or whatever worries I was focused on, and I had to then consider, uh, well, something's out there looking out for me, right? And maybe all the things that I said I believed up until now are actually true. And so I think that applies when we talk about humility and what it really is. Humility is really being able to see all of yourself, see every portion, the good, bad, and the ugly, on the full spectrum, and accept it, and still be able to put it away and consider that someone else may be going through the same thing, or even that we're all connected in that. I believe that's true humility. And humility usually leads to things like empathy. Empathy leads to compassion, right? Um, as I understand it, empathy is the quality of being able to recognize one's state and relate to it without adopting it, right? Compassion is taking action based on that understanding. And so I think compassion then leads to things like patience, and patience leads to kindness, um, and kindness leads to um, fulfillment and connection in a lot of cool ways. And I've never felt more connected than I am right now. I've never felt, even though there are times where I feel like I'm dealing with things by myself, even though I still have the tendencies to kind of sit back and observe before I jump right in, and even at times, feel like the odd person out in a group, or a scenario, or whatever the case. Um, but I know now I'm just waiting for an opportunity to see people at their core and be seen at my core. And you put down the performance, and I think that's one of the first steps to humility, right? And so I've wrestled with that for a while, right? Because there's a fake humility, right, that I think is actually pretty prominent in the church, right? Like, folks will say, like, oh, well, that wasn't me, that was God, and I believe that a degree of that is true, right? I believe that, um, the spirit of God is the thing that's keeping you going in the first place, right? Like, the breath of God, the breath of life, is really all you have to hold on to. And so, yes, a degree of that is God, right? We are adopting God's character, in these little fleshly sacks that we have. And so there's a degree of truth to that. But God made you a particular way that he didn't make me. He made me a particular way that he didn't make you, right? So it's not all that. It's not all God. If it were all God, it would be flawless. You know what I mean? As a matter of fact, um, Tim Ross was at Mosaic for the Mosaic conference, and, like, I think I'm quoting him when I say, you know what I mean? It wasn't all God, you know what I mean? Because I heard you up there. And we know it wasn't all God because you were a little pitchy, you know what I'm saying? And but again, being able to accept that, yeah, I probably was pretty pitchy, is humility, right? Being like, what do you mean I was pitchy, is proud. um, and to get past yourself to relate to another human being in that moment, is the example of humility, right? And so that seemed really, really important to talk about. I think a lot of people can get a lot of different presumptions or misconceptions about what I'm doing or what I'm saying, or you know what I mean. You see the little clips or sound bites on whatever TikTok or YouTube or Instagram or whatever, and you can go ahead and make your own presumptions about who I am, what I'm about, what the conversation is about, what I'm trying to address, who I'm for, who I'm against, and all of that. But really, all I'm trying to do is, in some ways, open myself all the way up so that you can see everything and you can make your determination as to whether you want to come in or not. And then after that, get out of the way and make it about you. How can I relate to you? How can I expose who I am so that you can feel safe enough to expose who you are? Um, it's funny. I had this conversation with a couple friends in church pretty frequently, and I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and what that means is that we were a church that believed in like miracles, signs, and wonders, and you see like like the conferences or whatever the case may be, where people getting hands put on their head and they falling out and all that. I experienced all that, people speaking in tongues, right? Like all that I experienced growing up in church, and people have all kinds of opinions about that, right? Like, is that real? Is that not? Yada yada yada. I can't tell you whether all of it is absolutely 100% authentic all the time, because I can't tell you that human beings are 100% authentic all the time. But what I can tell you is that there was a moment where I saw my mother get healed by a family member. As a matter of fact, um, they were told to go and lay hands on my mother's forehead. And my mother had been dealing with not being able to walk on her right side. And that's kind of always been a thing. My mother has had problems with her right knee and her right hip and her right ankle and all the rest of that. And like, it just, the right side is a thing that's real. Um, but I remember her having a cane at some point, and like braces and salon pause patches and all kinds of stuff. And she gets hands laid on her, and she starts dancing. And I'm like, yo, this, am I being punked? You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, if this is a practical joke, this is the wildest practical joke that I've ever experienced in my life, bro. Like, this sincerely cannot be real life. Um, and it was, because she started crying afterwards. And my mother was on the worship team and that type of thing. So, she's speaking into the mic, and she's like, and she's describing, she was like, I couldn't pivot before, I couldn't dance before. And then she starts doing it. And like, of course, like we're all joyous and clapping and that type of thing. And, even in that moment, I couldn't fully, truly accept God's love. But I had the first introduction to real humility when that person got up, walked over to my mother, in spite of whether they felt comfortable or not, in spite of whether they felt put on the spot or not, walked over to my mother, laid hands on her, and my mother was healed. Crazy stuff. And so I had the introduction to humility at that point. And I knew that even if all this was just this wild ruse and we were all delusional, and there was something that could be scientifically or you know, um, metaphysically explained to justify what had happened. What I did know is that it happened because of love. And I know that love has the furthest reach through humility. Through humility, we sacrifice. Through humility, we give and offer. Through humility, we're bold enough to relate. Through humility, we're able to forgive. As we consider who we are, and then we put all that to the side to see somebody else just as they are, and we choose to love, we're showing humility. And so I still battle with having a big ego. I do. There are times where I'm riding high. There are times where I'm really low. There are times where I'm pretty judgmental. There are times where I feel justified in thinking the things that I think about other people, whether it's acceptance or not, right? I know there's times where I think I'm the only person going through something. I know there's times where I've been so depressed that I've talked about and thought about taking my life. I know that I've been so selfish that I've taken advantage of women in relationships before. Um, I know that I've fashioned myself to be the hero in almost all of my stories growing up, uh, rather than the person who was contributing to the thing that was happening in front of me. Um, and yet, I can see all that, I can accept all that, and I can expose all that. And at the expense of what that may seem like or feel like, or whatever good or bad feedback that I get, whether people truly understand or even take the time to understand or not. In the last couple of weeks, or at least just in the last week, people have seen the clips of the last episode on TikTok, and one dude presumed I was gay. You know what I'm saying? Just 'cause, uh, in one of the moments, I talked about like how many of y'all are single and how many of y'all are still looking for fulfillment. Sleeping around with a bunch of men. And I just, in my natural mind, when I say sleeping around with men, I just presume we're talking about women sleeping around with men. I fully recognize that there's, no shade. I fully recognize that there's an entire body of people who are men that want to sleep with men, but like that's not what I was talking about. And so it kind of, I thought it was hilarious. You know what I mean? It was like I can only imagine what it would be like to be a black gay man, and I know that for me, sleep with a bunch of women isn't the answer. So I can only presume that sleeping with a bunch of men isn't the answer either. And I was like, that's hilarious, bro. I'm not gay. You were a victim of the soundbite. Go back and watch the episode. You know, we referenced back to the last episode, and I had said, in my childhood, I perceived my abuse to be the most positive thing that had happened to me at that time, right? And somebody was like, there were multiple people. Like somebody was like, no thanks with the little throwing up emoji, and then somebody else was like, the most positive experience of your life at 4 years old. Somebody, you know what I mean? Check the tech on this person, because like I don't think this guy is safe, right? And you know, rather than getting up in arms or feeling the need to justify myself or defend myself or, you know, even argue to any degree, take the time to be like, I know who I am. Number one, I can see how you came to that conclusion. Number two, I don't blame you at all. I get it. And also, how can I invite you into the conversation? Right. And so I can't say I'm the most humble person in the world. As a matter of fact, if I were to suggest that I was the most humble person in the world, that would be a very proud statement. Um, but I can say that it's being revealed to me more and more that true love comes with humility. And even as a parent, I try and make sure that my kids see all of me. If I flip out and, I get to a point where I raise my voice with them or whatever the case may be, I come back and I apologize. And they say, yeah, daddy was frustrated or daddy was upset, and here's why. And it's not about you, and I shouldn't have treated you like that. And, we hug it out, and that type of thing. Um, I do my best that whenever I recognize a wrong, I'll go back and be like, hey, I see how you saw that I was being this type of way, right? I want to apologize for that. Um, can we start over and can we get to a place of understanding? And I don't know. Even if at any point in time that makes me seem like I'm weak or I'm less than or any of that, again, I know who I am and I can let go of how I want to be perceived in order to open up the space to love. I guess that makes me a little humble, right? So thank you once again for joining me for another conversation here on the Baggage Claim. Listen, I am excited for the rest of the season. I don't know how many more episodes I'm going to do, y'all. I haven't decided whether this is just going to be 12 episodes for the season or whether it's going to be 20 episodes or whatever it's going to look like, right? But definitely stay tuned. I want to be interviewing some people moving forward. So if you would love to collaborate or something like that, send me a DM um, or whatever. Just find some way to get in contact with me. We'll talk about it. If you want to unpack some baggage, I'm here for it because, like I said, we heal together. But do all the things, folks. Like, subscribe, share this thing, and turn on your notifications so that you know whenever another episode drops. And until next time, yo, be love, travel lighter, sit down, be humble. I love y'all. I'll take it easy.